The best way to think about it is that it's a method for studying social relations of all kinds, wherever they might occur. So it's a process of relational sociology. And if you think about it in largely visual terms, it involves representing individuals, groups, organizations by points on a piece of paper, and then their social relationships as lines between those points. So it's a matter of joining up the dots. And the network is that pattern of lines amongst the dots, the relations amongst the people, the relations amongst the organizations. Social network analysis is really a way of using mathematical methods for studying the patterns and processes of those networks. And while it started out as simply drawing the diagrams and trying to interpret them, it's developed into a much more sophisticated methodology that means you can analyze these structures without actually looking at the diagrams at all. But it's useful to think in terms of points and lines, or nodes and ties, as they're sometimes called. The kind of concepts developed within network analysis are things like the density of the structure, how many lines there are and how much they overlap, and the texture of the structure. Is someone the focus of attention, lots of lines going into them? Are they a popular person in terms of friendship choice? Are they a wheeler-dealer in terms of economic transactions, or are they a broker in terms of political influence? Conversely, looking at peripherality, those who are on the margins, in the liminal areas, and you can compare the attributes of people in those different positions. And I think you can also look at the fact that there are always multiple networks. So there's not simply one social network. There are kind of friendship networks, economic networks, political networks, religious networks, and so on. And those networks relate to one another. So we need to look at different types and qualities of relationships. That's probably one of the areas in which your interest in multi-level methods and models might be appropriate.
Yes. In the 1980s, multi-level modelling took off predominantly in school effectiveness studies. So some of you might have heard of Harvey Goldstein or Nick Longford. They were looking at variation in exam scores of pupils or students within schools. And the problem with aggregating to a school average and then forming a league table is you lose the variation within the school, the variation between different pupils, between different students. So multi-level modelling is very much a model for variation, for taking into account population structure, social population structure. So now we've got things like variations in health by local area. So if you like health geography, more recently moving into non-hierarchical structures, also recognising the value of the multi-level approach for longitudinal studies. So the idea that observations can be made within a person, so people's blood pressure could be taken in spring, summer, autumn and winter. These are then clustered within the individual as correlated observations. With multi-level modelling, we are recognising that society has a population structure. Sometimes you want to say, okay, I know society has a structure, but I want to take that into account and then get a population averaged relationship between something. More often, you are actually interested explicitly in that structure. So the multi-level model provides a way of taking into account structure, but also allowing you to focus on particular aspects of it. The thing that's been missing until fairly recently in that framework has been the social network. So if you are looking for a job, it could be your qualifications, it could be the job market of the local area, but we all know it's also who you know, isn't it? It's your social network. So how do we bring the who you know alongside the way you live and who you are? So with multi-level modelling, we're interested in population structure. So therefore, that's very typical of social network analysis. The structure is itself very much of interest. And then, having taken into account that structure, how can we look at variation?
That's a big contribution because it avoids seeing any kind of social structure as being kind of flat. It's recognising that social life is hierarchical, it involves various levels. And I think that perhaps there has been a tendency within social network analysis for it to depict a rather flat structure. It's not only been static, but it's caught up with presenting pretty pictures and summaries of a structure, rather like crystal structures and snowflakes and so on. And there was always the kind of reaction that I got from many critics, so what? You produce these pretty pictures, but so what? And I think multi-level analysis is posing a much more sophisticated way of analysing social structure.
My background is in quantitative social science, and so I've been very interested in the contribution of statistical models. Do you see social network analysis as quant or qual? Or a mixture of the two? I mean, I very much value qual and mixed methods approaches alongside quant, so I'd be interested to know how you feel about it.
I mean, I've always thought that social network analysis is neither and both. It appears to be quantitative because it uses numbers, but it's actually trying to grasp the qualitative features of a social structure. It is really that attempt to be sociological in the sense of being structural. Trying to understand variations in structure as a way of visualizing the network. Some of the most recent developments in network analysis was the development of computing technology that you can actually construct images of a network and view them on a screen, rotate them around, examine them from various ways. And that is a purely qualitative process of interpretation, even though there's a lot of quantitative behind it. So I think in that sense it's a method that potentially breaks down the division between those areas. But having said that, just because a technique is possible to calculate, we calculate it. What you need to do is to understand the meaning of the relationship you're looking at, and does it make sense to use this measure there. Some of the work that's going on in network analysis at the moment is actually trying to link cultural and discursive ideas with network analysis, to actually look at how social relationships are culturally constructed, and therefore network analysis is clearly embedded in these cultural concerns. But I was certainly led to question that when thinking about the growth of network analysis in animal behaviour.
Just to immediately respond to that, I published some work last year with some colleagues looking at interactions amongst a group of jackdaws about how they share food, and I do think animal behaviour is a really important area of research. Such fantastic data. Of course, we're all animals at the end of the day, so it does actually apply. But there's fantastic data on non-human animals. Second thing is that I certainly, with these models, then yes, there's the danger of the method preceding the question. You get the statistics all, to use your phrase, John. And the danger of not having a social hypothesis or research question that motivates the use of these techniques. The multi-level modelling that you might use for social network analysis should of course be preceded by the hypotheses that you want to test about variation. The first time I saw the multi-level model applied in a social network context was for the social relations model, which some of you may have heard of, David A. Kenny's work in psychology, and Tom Schneider's and Roel Bosker in the first edition of Multi-Level Modelling, 1999. There were 4 pages about how multi-level models could be used to fit the social relations model, which I found really fascinating. But this was all to do with research questions about ties within a family of emotional warmth between, say, mother and daughter, mother and son, son to father, son to mother. So there's all these ties within the family, and we can't think of them as being independent units. They're all interrelated by definition. And understanding the way in which these interact with this kind of model. There were very good research questions that preceded the method.
That's again perhaps pointing to something on which we could probably conclude the kind of the importance of bringing together this variety of methods, quantitative and qualitative, single level, multiple level, statistical and so on, that we shouldn't see our methods in these kind of discrete little boxes, but we should always try and engage in this kind of constructive dialogue of how they can be made to intersect and fit together.
Absolutely. For example, a multi-level analysis of social network data might be a quantitative way of suggesting where to look next with a qual approach. So definitely the two things go together in a mixed methods approach.
Yeah.
In your own research, come across things using the methods you've spoken about? Have you come across anything that was radical or really shocking or really surprising to you?
The thing that struck me most about some of the network research that I've done has not been an especially radical thing, but simply the fact that there's such constancy in network structure. There's been so little change. If you look at structures of networks over time, you look at networks in different areas, the same broad characteristics. So looking at corporate networks, there's been very slow, gradual change. The old boy network, has developed, but it's always there. That lack of change is the thing that has struck me so much. When we expect that we're living in a world in which things are changing so radically, we talk about globalization and so on. Yet network analysis in this area has shown change isn't quite so radical, and it reflects something of these small world characteristics of the networks, that small world networks are quite conservative in terms of maintaining that structure. It's quite difficult to change them, and there are unpredictable consequences if those conditions do break down.
If I go back to something I described early on when I was talking about multi-level modelling, one of the motivators for that was school effectiveness. And prior to that, what people would do is aggregate the number of people that had passed GCSEs at a certain level and give a score to each school. So essentially it's a single level analysis at the school level. You aggregate the information, and then you've got 10 schools in the Durham area, let's say, and you rank them in order. Now, one of the many problems of that is that you'd lose the variation within the school. You don't know the value added by the school in terms of the intake and so on. So the multi-level approaches that followed on from that were motivated by social phenomena, were motivated by research questions, were highly valuable approaches, and did show that what people saw as this aggregate difference, when you looked at it in more detail, was a very different picture. So I'm not sure it was a shock, but better reflected what happens in real life, because each student at particular time points goes to a particular school. More recently, with the research that my colleagues and I did with bringing the network into the individual and school context, so in between, if you like, the individual and the school is the network of friends. What we found was some suggestions that what had been seen as a school difference in a multi-level, even though a sophisticated multi-level analysis that was right, before you put the network in, the school differences seem bigger than when you take the network into account. So what that suggests is that what might have been viewed as school differences of, let's put a number on it, let's say the school difference was 5, when you put the network in, it might go down to 3. In other words, some of what you thought was school difference is actually within school between pupil network variation. So it does allow you to have a more detailed picture of differences and variations. So I don't know whether I'd use the word shock, but it certainly sharpens the focus on something that you want to look at.
I'm just wondering to what extent public health scientists are using these methods. Because it certainly seems to me that knowing about networks could really help with trying to change behaviours and that kind of thing.
A big project carried out some years ago by Tony Cox and was about sexual contact and trying to link that to the spread of AIDS, so that you could actually do contact tracing. Coxon used diary methods, people keeping diary accounts of their sexual contacts, and that you could therefore predict spread of disease, illness and so on through studying the network. And I think there have been some attempts to look at different groups within the network. That if you code the points in your network by gender, by class and age and so on, and you can see if the pattern of contacts and therefore the rate of spread is different according to those social attributes.
Just to add to that, I'm doing some work at the moment with a colleague based at the University of Laval with 6 European countries in the SILNIS study. It's health behaviours within peer networks within schools. You've got smoking cannabis, alcohol and physical exercise with these health behaviours, looking at the variation of that between individuals, between their peer networks and between the schools, but also in a pan-European study. And there's definitely a lot of potential for understanding the role of the network, the peer network in behaviour and so on, because the behaviour that you might start at school might persist to later life and therefore has massive ramifications in terms of public health. And also, I think there's some real value in looking at interventions in this context as well.
One of the things that health science should do is try and predict what will happen next. So the networks seem to be very good at explaining past behaviour. Given the current state, how good are they at explaining future behaviour, or are they just telling us how difficult it is to predict future behaviour? The example I know is the multi-level modelling technique. It essentially rendered a lot of the league tables and school ranking is not particularly helpful.
Right. So this might be an example where the quant and qual comes together. That the quant could be objectively summarise health data, the state of it now, and then the follow-up could either be quant or qual intervention. I don't see these as predominantly predictive models. I see them as descriptive, where you can describe the relative share of variation in behaviour that might then go on to influence behaviour in later life. But it gives you a way of identifying where to look next. I don't see it as looking beyond that time frame at the moment with the kinds of models that I'm familiar with.
Predictive research is probably no more problematic in these areas than in other areas of the social sciences, but that you can, if you're willing to make certain assumptions about other things being equal, you can draw predictive conclusions. I'm thinking of a very early piece of social network analysis in this area by James Coleman in the US, who looked at the take-up of a new drug, and he was looking at how medical practitioners discovered about the benefits of prescribing this, and therefore how you could explain and therefore predict the speed of the take-up. So he was finding that it was important to know who people turned to get information, and it was kind of the trusted advisors. So certain medical practitioners who were important trusted sources, if you were well connected to them, you were likely to hear about this drug. And so the drug companies needed to get their information out to those key individuals rather than blanket broadcasting of this. And so that gives you some basis for predicting that those techniques for identifying the central individuals, the key brokers, might provide a way of predicting take-up of not only drugs but other innovations in other areas. And certainly there's been some attempt to do that.